Former FBI agent Ethan Cole sat silently in a crowded courtroom, dressed like a homeless man no one bothered to respect. 3 white police officers laughed behind him, certain this was an easy conviction. The prosecutor smirked. Even his court-appointed lawyer seemed ready to give up. To them, Ethan was just another poor black defendant, already guilty in their eyes. What they didn't know was that every lie, every insult, and every act of cruelty was part of a trap. They thought silence meant weakness. They were wrong. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The morning air in Riverside, Ohio, was damp and gray, the kind that pressed against the skin like a quiet weight. A cold drizzle had passed through the city just before dawn, leaving the streets slick and the sky heavy with low, unmoving clouds. Old brick buildings lined the courthouse square, their faded facades a reminder of a city that once mattered more than it did now. By 8:30 a.m., people were already filing into the county courthouse, not out of interest, but obligation. Courtroom 4B was full. Not full with tension or expectation, but with bodies. Defendants waiting their turn. Families staring at the floor. Lawyers flipping through files they had already decided the outcome of. The room smelled faintly of dust, cheap coffee, and old paper. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a pale, unforgiving glow over everyone inside. To most of the people present, this was just another small case on a long docket. At the defense table sat Ethan Cole. He appeared to be in his late 30s, though hardship had blurred the exact line of his age. He was tall but thin, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he had learned to make himself smaller in public spaces. His skin was dark, weathered by time outdoors. A rough beard shadowed his jaw, uneven and untrimmed. His clothes looked like donations picked up from a shelter. An oversized brown jacket with a torn cuff, a faded gray hoodie underneath, jeans worn thin at the knees, and scuffed boots that had clearly walked many miles. He smelled faintly of cold air and soap, the kind used in public restrooms. Ethan's hands rested calmly on the table, fingers loosely interlaced. There was no shaking, no visible fear. His eyes were lowered, not in shame but in stillness. Anyone glancing at him would have assumed resignation, acceptance. Another man already defeated by the system. Behind him, in the first row of the gallery, sat 3 uniformed police officers. They did not bother to hide their amusement. Officer Brian Holt sat in the middle. He was broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with close-cropped blonde hair and a square jaw that always looked tense, even when he smiled. Holt carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. His grin was sharp, cruel at the edges, and his pale blue eyes kept drifting toward Ethan with open contempt. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, radiating ownership of the room. To Holt's left sat Officer Mark Riley, slimmer and slightly shorter, with neatly combed brown hair and a carefully maintained mustache. Riley had the look of a man who practiced appearing reasonable. His smile was softer, more controlled, but no less dangerous. He shook his head occasionally as if disappointed by the very existence of the defendant. To anyone watching casually, he looked like the good cop. On Holt's right was Officer Daniel Cruz, younger than the other 2, with dark hair and tired eyes. His uniform fit too neatly, pressed within an inch of its life. Cruz laughed when Holt laughed, though his was more nervous, more forced. He avoided looking directly at Ethan, choosing instead to whisper and smirk when prompted. They leaned toward one another, exchanging glances and quiet jokes. "Won't even take an hour," Holt muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Riley chuckled under his breath. "Paperwork'll take longer than the verdict." Cruz snorted, covering his mouth with his hand. At the prosecution table stood Nathan Walker, the assistant district attorney assigned to the case. Walker was in his early 40s, clean-cut, wearing a tailored navy suit that fit him just a little too well. His hair was dark and carefully styled, his tie perfectly centered. He reviewed his notes with a faint, satisfied smile, tapping a pen against the folder as if already bored. This case, to him, was a formality, a stepping stone, an easy conviction built on uniform testimony. He didn't look at Ethan when the defendant's name was read. He didn't need to. On the other side of the defense table sat Emily Carter, the court-appointed public defender. Emily was 27, tall and slender, with straight auburn hair pulled back into a low ponytail. Her suit was inexpensive but professional, slightly loose at the shoulders. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes, evidence of long nights and too many cases. She kept her gaze on her paperwork, flipping through pages without urgency. To anyone watching, she looked disengaged. She did not greet Ethan when she sat down. She did not whisper reassurance or ask if he was ready. When Ethan briefly turned his head toward her, she did not meet his eyes. Emily Carter appeared indifferent. Another lawyer already calculating how quickly she could close this file and move on. In the jury box, 12 citizens sat stiffly in their seats. Among them was Angela Morris, a black woman in her early 50s, wearing a modest blue dress and glasses perched low on her nose. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. From the moment she entered the room, her posture had been tense. As she watched the officers laugh behind Ethan, her jaw tightened. She glanced toward the judge, then back at the defendant, discomfort flickering across her face, but she said nothing. 2 seats down from her sat Kevin Brooks, a young local reporter barely out of college. He wore a wrinkled blazer and held a notepad that already contained more doodles than notes. His eyes drifted around the room, unimpressed. He had covered enough minor court cases to know when nothing newsworthy was going to happen. This was another poor defendant, another routine conviction. He wrote Ethan's name down, yawned internally, and waited for it to be over. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Judge Harold Whitman, a man in his late 60s with thinning gray hair and a lined face, took his seat behind the bench. His expression was neutral, practiced. He had presided over thousands of cases in this room. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the docket, and sighed quietly. "Be seated," he said. As the room settled, Ethan lifted his eyes just enough to take everything in. The officer's confidence, the prosecutor's boredom, the lawyer's distance, the juror's quiet assumptions, the judge's weariness. He watched how Holt leaned forward when Walker spoke, how Riley nodded at the right moments, how Cruz avoided eye contact when the bailiff passed too close. He noticed Angela Morris shifting in her seat, uncomfortable but restrained. He noticed the reporter barely paying attention. Ethan Cole absorbed it all without a change in expression. This was not his first courtroom. He had seen rooms like this from the other side, rooms where decisions were made quickly, where lives were sorted into categories. He knew how power moved when it thought it was unobserved. The clerk called the case. Walker stood smoothly, confidence in every movement. "Your Honor," he began, voice clear and controlled, "this is a straightforward matter involving assault on law enforcement and possession of illegal substances." Holt smiled wider. Emily did not look up. Ethan lowered his gaze again, appearing small, quiet, exactly as expected, and the courtroom, heavy with routine and assumption, prepared to move forward, unaware that every reaction, every word, every glance was being carefully studied by the man they believed had no power at all. The morning dragged on, slow and dull. Just another case. So they thought. The bailiff called the first witness, and Officer Brian Holt rose from the gallery with a confidence that bordered on swagger. Up close, Holt looked even larger, well over 6 feet thick through the chest, his uniform stretched tight across his shoulders. His blonde hair was cut brutally short, as if softness were a liability. He walked to the stand with the relaxed gait of someone who had done this many times before. Someone who trusted the room to bend around him. He took the oath without hesitation, lips barely moving, eyes already scanning the jury for allies. "Officer Holt," Nathan Walker began, stepping closer with an easy smile. "Please tell the court what happened on the night of the arrest." Holt leaned into the microphone. "We encountered the defendant late at night," he said, voice steady, practiced. "He appeared intoxicated. Strong smell of alcohol, slurred speech, unsteady on his feet." He paused, letting the image settle. "When we attempted to question him, he became aggressive, belligerent. He swung at me without provocation." Holt gestured with his hand, reenacting a punch that never happened. "We feared for our safety." From the defense table, Ethan Cole remained still. He did not look up. His breathing stayed slow, measured. Inside, memory stirred. Not of that night, but of others like it. Different streets, different names. The same story told over and over, until it became truth simply because it was repeated by a badge. Walker nodded sympathetically. "And how did the defendant behave after you tried to restrain him?" "Like an animal," Holt said before catching himself, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "Out of control. The kind of strength you see when someone's drunk or high. You know the type." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Angela Morris, the juror, stiffened. Her fingers curled tighter in her lap. She glanced at the judge, then back at Holt, waiting for correction that never came. Walker didn't flinch. He let it pass. At the clerk's desk, Martha Bell, a court clerk in her early 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, frowned. She had worked in this courthouse for nearly 3 decades. She had heard exaggeration before, but this was careless. She glanced at the judge, then down at her papers, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. Holt finished his testimony with a firm declaration. "We used only the force necessary to protect ourselves and the public." Walker smiled. "Thank you, officer." Holt stepped down, shooting a quick glance toward Ethan, a look full of certainty, as if the verdict were already written. The second witness was called. Officer Mark Riley approached the stand with slower steps. Where Holt dominated space, Riley occupied it carefully. He was in his late 30s, with a narrow frame and a face that seemed permanently concerned. His brown hair was combed neatly to the side, his mustache trimmed just enough to look respectable. He carried himself like a man who wanted to be liked. Riley took the oath, then placed one hand over his chest as he sat. "Officer Riley," Walker said gently, "can you describe your role in the incident?" Riley nodded, swallowing. "I was there to support Officer Holt. We saw the defendant acting erratically. Honestly, I was worried for him." He pressed his palm harder against his chest. "We deal with people in crisis all the time. Sometimes they need help before they hurt themselves or others." He winced slightly, drawing attention to his ribs. When Officer Holt tried to speak with him, the defendant lashed out. I stepped in to de-escalate. Riley's voice softened. "That's when he struck me, right here." He tapped his chest again, grimacing. Angela Morris's brow furrowed. She glanced at the medical records on the screen. No hospital visit, no imaging, no documented injury beyond minor discomfort. Walker turned toward the jury. "Officer Riley, were you trying to arrest the defendant at that moment?" "No, sir," Riley said. "I was trying to protect the community. That's our job." Behind them, Holt nodded approvingly. The judge watched impassively, hands folded. Then came the third witness. Officer Daniel Cruz approached the stand with less confidence. Up close, the fatigue in his face was more apparent. Dark circles under his eyes, a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth. He was the youngest of the 3, late 20s with olive-toned skin and neatly trimmed black hair. His uniform was immaculate, but his posture betrayed tension. Cruz cleared his throat. "After the arrest, we transported the defendant to the precinct." Walker leaned forward. "And did anything unusual occur during transport?" "Yes," Cruz said quickly. "The defendant became violent again. He kicked the interior of the patrol car, damaged the door panel, screamed threats. "What kind of threats?" Walker asked. Cruz hesitated. "General threats. Against officers. Against people like us." Ethan felt it then, the familiar tightening in his chest. The phrase, "people like us," was one he had heard before, whispered in hallways, spoken openly when no one thought it mattered. He remembered another man, years ago, handcuffed on a curb, framed the same way. That man hadn't had a lawyer who even pretended to care. He had taken a plea and disappeared into the system. Cruz finished his testimony quickly, eyes darting toward Holt for reassurance. When it was time for cross-examination, Emily Carter finally stood. She adjusted her jacket, cleared her throat, and approached the podium with hesitant steps. Up close, her youth was unmistakable. She looked like someone still learning where to place her hands, how loudly to speak. She flipped through her notes, buying time. "Officer Holt," she began softly, "you stated the defendant smelled strongly of alcohol. Was a breathalyzer administered?" Walker was on his feet immediately. "Objection. Relevance." "Sustained," Judge Whitman said without hesitation. Emily nodded quickly. "Of course, Your Honor. Officer Riley, you mentioned a chest injury. Were you taken to the hospital?" Riley shook his head. "Didn't feel necessary." "No imaging, x-rays?" Emily asked. Walker cut in again. "Asked and answered." "Sustained." Emily's shoulders tensed. She tried once more. "Officer Cruz, regarding the alleged damage to the patrol car, are there photographs?" Cruz hesitated. "I believe the report covers that." Walker smiled faintly. "The report is already in evidence." Emily paused, eyes flicking to the judge, then back to her notes. "No further questions," she said quietly, returning to her seat. To anyone watching, it looked like defeat. Walker smirked. Holt leaned back, satisfied. Riley lowered his eyes, playing humble. Cruz exhaled in relief. At the clerk's desk, Martha Bell shook her head again, more visibly this time. Ethan did not move. But inside, the faces of other men passed through his mind, men who had sat where he sat now, listening to the same words, watching the same performance. Men who had believed the truth would matter on its own. The courtroom settled into a familiar rhythm, comfortable in its assumptions. The judge called for a brief recess, and Ethan Cole, still silent, watched them all, counting the lies, noting the confidence with which they were delivered, knowing exactly how much damage certainty could do when no one bothered to question it. The recess bell echoed through courtroom 4B, thin and metallic, cutting through the murmurs as people stood and stretched. Lawyers gathered their papers. Jurors whispered to one another. The officers laughed quietly among themselves, confident the worst was already over. To them, the case had gone exactly as expected. At the defense table, Ethan Cole remained seated. From the outside, nothing about him changed. His shoulders stayed slightly hunched. His hands rested loosely in front of him. His eyes remained downcast, unfocused, as if he were drifting somewhere far away. To anyone watching, he looked exhausted. Another man, worn down by accusation and inevitability. Inside, however, Ethan was fully awake. He had been awake since the moment Holt's voice first echoed through the room. Ethan was not a drifter. He was not homeless. He was not powerless. He was the field commander of Operation Hollow Badge, a federal corruption investigation that had been running quietly for nearly 11 months. The assignment had come to him not because he wanted it, but because he was uniquely suited for it. Ethan had grown up learning how to disappear in plain sight. He knew how to be overlooked, underestimated. He knew how systems treated men who looked like him when no one important was watching. That knowledge had made him invaluable. The night of the arrest replayed in his mind. Not emotionally, but tactically. He remembered the rain on cracked pavement. The way Holt's grip had tightened when Ethan didn't respond fast enough. The shove into brick. The staged urgency in Riley's voice. The sound of Cruz's body camera being accidentally knocked loose. Every second had been captured, stored, encrypted, transmitted. A pin-sized camera sewn into the lining of Ethan's jacket. A secondary audio recorder disguised as a frayed button. Redundancies built on redundancies. He had allowed the beating. He had allowed the handcuffs. He had allowed the evidence to be planted. Because the trap required patience. Across the room, Emily Carter sat with her legs crossed, posture still closed, expression carefully neutral. To the untrained eye, she looked shaken by how badly the testimony had gone. She kept her gaze on her notes, pen hovering but rarely touching the page. Emily had been trained to perform weakness. She was taller than most women in the room, slim with long limbs that made her seem fragile if she didn't stand straight. Her face was soft, almost gentle, freckled, with light hazel eyes that made people underestimate her. She spoke quietly by nature, which many mistook for uncertainty. Years ago, during law school, a professor had told her she would never survive trial work because she didn't have the voice for it. That same professor had later asked her to recommend him for a judicial appointment. Emily remembered that moment often. It had taught her how dangerous assumptions could be. Her real badge wasn't visible. It never was. A legal liaison credential issued under a sealed name, tucked inside a false bottom briefcase. Emily Carter existed only for cases like this, cases where the system needed to believe she was incompetent. During the recess, Emily stood and walked toward the clerk's desk. Martha Bell, the senior court clerk, looked up as Emily approached. Up close, Martha's face showed its age, deep lines around her mouth, eyes sharp despite the years. She had the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime keeping order without authority. She didn't smile. "Can I help you, counselor?" Martha asked. Emily lowered her voice. "I was hoping to clarify the scheduling notes for this case. There seems to be a discrepancy between the hearing dates and the conference room reservations." Martha raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" Emily nodded, sliding a printed calendar forward. "I just don't want to file anything incorrectly." Martha studied Emily for a moment. Then, slowly, she turned her screen just enough for Emily to see. A list of private meetings appeared, off-the-record conferences, some marked with initials instead of names. Holt, Riley, Cruz, Walker, dates that didn't align with standard procedure. Martha tapped the screen lightly. "Some things don't belong in the open," she said quietly, "but they leave footprints." Emily gave a small, grateful nod. "Thank you." Martha didn't reply. But when Emily stepped away, the clerk's fingers moved quickly, copying files to an external drive hidden beneath her desk. In the hallway, outside the courtroom, Officer Lucas Grant leaned against a vending machine pretending to scroll through his phone. He was young, early 20s, with a narrow build and a nervous habit of chewing the inside of his cheek. His uniform looked new, worn stiffly, as if he hadn't grown into it yet. Grant wasn't supposed to be here. He had joined the Riverside Police Department believing in structure, in order, believing he could help. It had taken less than 6 months for that belief to crack. He had seen reports rewritten, evidence mislabeled, complaints buried, and he had seen Holt, always Holt, smiling through it all. When Ethan had been brought into the precinct weeks earlier, Grant had been the one assigned to inventory belongings. He had noticed the weight of the jacket, the odd placement of a button. He had said nothing then, but he remembered. Now, as Emily passed by, their eyes met briefly. Grant's hand slipped from his phone, brushing the pocket of his jacket. Once, twice. A signal. Emily continued walking without reacting. Later, Grant would leave an envelope in a trash bin outside the courthouse. Inside would be internal logs, timestamps, vehicle GPS data that contradicted official reports. enough to crack a foundation already weakened by arrogance. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Harold Whitman sat alone at the bench, reviewing notes he had not planned to revisit. The room felt different now, less routine, more exposed. He rubbed his temple, discomfort settling in his chest. Whitman had been a judge for 22 years. He prided himself on efficiency, on keeping cases moving, on trusting officers who had earned that trust through repetition. But something about this one bothered him. The defense lawyer's performance had been too flat, too deliberate. And the defendant, Whitman glanced toward Ethan's empty chair, had not reacted the way most men did under that kind of testimony. No anger, no fear, no visible despair. That unsettled him. The judge leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment, wondering, briefly, if he had missed something important. The recess ended. Everyone returned to their places. Holt whispered something to Riley, who laughed. Cruz wiped his palms on his uniform pants. Walker straightened his tie, confidence intact. Ethan sat down once more, the picture of quiet defeat. But beneath the surface, the living trap tightened. Every lie spoken had been documented. Every unauthorized meeting logged. Every payment tracked. The system believed it was consuming another disposable man. It did not realize it was feeding the investigation exactly what it needed. And Emily Carter, eyes down, pen idle, waited patiently. Not for justice, for timing. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere in courtroom 4B had shifted. Subtly at first, like a change in pressure before a storm. People returned to their seats more slowly. Conversations faded quicker. Even the fluorescent lights seemed harsher now, casting sharper edges across faces that had grown too comfortable. Emily Carter stood before anyone called her name. She straightened, smoothing her jacket once, then stepped away from the defense table with a posture that no longer tried to be small. The timid slump was gone. Her shoulders were squared, her chin lifted. When she turned to face the bench, her hazel eyes were clear and focused, her voice steady in a way it had not been before. "Your Honor," she said, "before the prosecution rests, the defense has preliminary motions." The words landed heavier than they should have. Nathan Walker looked up sharply. He frowned, irritation flashing across his face. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense had ample opportunity." "I'm aware," Emily replied calmly, cutting in without raising her voice. It was the first time she had interrupted him all day. A few heads turned. Kevin Brooks, the young reporter, paused mid-note. He looked up from his pad, curiosity replacing boredom. Something in Emily's tone had changed. Something that didn't belong to a defeated public defender. Judge Harold Whitman studied her for a long moment. "Proceed," he said cautiously. Emily nodded once. She reached into her briefcase and removed a thin stack of documents, placing them neatly on the clerk's desk. "The defense submits these records into evidence," she said. "They document a series of off-the-record meetings between Officers Holt, Riley, Cruz, and Assistant District Attorney Walker over the last 4 months, meetings that do not appear in any official scheduling logs." A low murmur rippled through the room. Walker was on his feet immediately. "Objection. Discovery is closed. This is a procedural ambush." Emily turned to face him fully. "These records were obtained this morning," she said evenly, "and were transmitted to your office at 9:12 a.m. Walker's jaw tightened. He glanced down at his phone on the table, fingers moving quickly. His face drained of color as he scrolled. An email header glowed on the screen. From Federal Records Division. Subject: Supplemental Disclosure. Case 4B. Walker swallowed. Holt leaned forward in his seat, brow furrowing. "What is she talking about?" he hissed under his breath, turning toward Cruz. Cruz avoided his gaze. His hands were shaking. Judge Whitman cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter," he said, On what grounds are you introducing this material now? Emily met his eyes. On the grounds that the evidence was sealed under federal review until this morning. The delay was not by choice, Your Honor. Silence fell, the kind that pressed in on the ears. Emily continued. Additionally, the defense submits this. She produced a small black USB drive, holding it up just long enough for the jury to see. Audio and video recordings from the night of the arrest. Holt surged halfway to his feet. That's impossible, he snapped. Our body cameras were damaged. Walker spun toward him. Sit down, he whispered harshly. Emily didn't look at them. The recordings do not originate from police equipment, she said. They originate from a third-party source present at the scene. Walker shook his head. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The defendant cannot simply, I will decide what is outrageous, Judge Whitman said sharply. He leaned forward, fingers gripping the edge of the bench. Ms. Carter, I will allow the submission. The court will view the evidence. For the first time since the trial began, Holt looked uncertain. As the bailiff took the USB and handed it to the court technician, Holt turned on Cruz. You said there were no cameras, he muttered, voice low and furious. Cruz's face was pale. I didn't see any, he whispered back. I swear. Riley leaned in, trying to keep his voice calm. Relax. It's probably nothing. Grainy footage? Won't show context? But Holt's foot bounced against the floor, betraying him. At the prosecution table, Walker stared at his phone again, thumb hovering uselessly over the screen. The email had come from a domain he recognized, one he had hoped never to see attached to his name. FBI.gov. In the gallery, Kevin Brooks sat up straighter. He flipped to a clean page in his notebook. His pen hovered, ready. Whatever this was, it wasn't routine anymore. The technician signaled readiness. Emily took a step back, returning to the defense table. As she passed Ethan Cole, she met his eyes briefly. Just a fraction of a second. Long enough for him to see the resolve there. Long enough for him to know the timing had arrived. Judge Whitman nodded. Play the recording. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. Static cleared. Nighttime footage appeared. Dim streetlights, wet pavement reflecting amber halos. The angle was steady, chest level, unshaken. A voice filled the room. Calm, controlled. Ethan's voice. Good evening, officers. Is there a problem? A collective inhale swept through the courtroom. On screen, Holt stepped into frame, face hard, posture aggressive. You're the problem, he said. You don't belong here. Gasps erupted as the footage continued, clear, unmistakable. Ethan standing still, hands visible, no aggression, no slurred speech. Then the shove. Angela Morris brought a hand to her mouth. On screen, Holt's baton appeared. Riley's voice followed. He's resisting. Even as Ethan said, clearly, I am not resisting. In the gallery, someone whispered, Oh my God. Walker sank slowly back into his chair. The footage continued, capturing Cruz fumbling with his body camera, the crunch of plastic, Holt's voice. Good. That's done. Then, the moment that shattered what remained of their story. Holt's hand reaching into his own pocket, producing a small bag, and shoving it into Ethan's jacket. The screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute. Judge Whitman removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose with trembling fingers. When he looked up again, his expression had changed. Gone was the weary neutrality. What remained was something colder. Mr. Walker, he said quietly, do you have an explanation? Walker opened his mouth, closed it. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. Your Honor, I was not aware. That, Whitman interrupted, is becoming a pattern. Holt stood abruptly. "This is entrapment," he shouted. "This whole thing." "Sit down," the judge snapped. "Now." Holt froze. Slowly, he lowered himself back into his seat, eyes darting toward the exits. Emily rose once more. "Your Honor," she said, "the defense rests its preliminary motion." Ethan remained seated, outwardly unchanged, but the room no longer saw him as small. They saw him clearly now, and for the first time they understood that the trial they thought was ending had only just begun. The courtroom did not breathe. For several seconds after the screen went dark, no one moved. The silence was heavy, unnatural, as if sound itself had been pulled out of the room. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, suddenly too loud, too present. Every face was turned forward, eyes fixed on the blank screen where the truth had just played out without mercy or commentary. At the defense table, Ethan Cole sat exactly as he had before, hands folded, posture slightly slouched, expression neutral. If anyone had been watching him closely, they would have noticed the only change. His eyes were no longer lowered. He looked straight ahead now, calm and unwavering, as if the room had finally caught up to where he had been all along. On the screen, the final frozen image replayed itself in the minds of everyone present. Ethan standing still, hands visible, voice steady. Officer Brian Holt shoving him into a brick wall. Officer Mark Riley shouting, "He's resisting," while stepping in to block the view. Officer Daniel Cruz fumbling with his body camera, then deliberately smashing it against the pavement. Holt's hand slipping into his own pocket. The bag, the plant. Reality had arrived without apology. In the jury box, Angela Morris felt something break inside her. She had watched trials like this before, listened to officers speak with confidence, seen defendants shrink under the weight of accusation. She had told herself that the system worked, even when it was imperfect. But this was not imperfection. This was cruelty performed with routine precision. A sob escaped her before she could stop it. She pressed her hand to her mouth, shoulders shaking. The woman beside her reached over instinctively, resting a hand on Angela's arm. Angela didn't pull away. Tears slid down her cheeks as she stared at the officers, no longer able to look at Ethan. Across the aisle, another juror wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, jaw clenched so tight it trembled. At the bench, Judge Harold Whitman had gone pale. The color drained from his face as he leaned back slowly, as though the weight of what he had just seen pressed physically against him. His hands that had signed warrants, dismissed objections, moved cases along with practiced efficiency, now trembled slightly against the armrests of his chair. Whitman's mind betrayed him. Not to this case alone, but to others. Faces blurred together. Defendants he barely remembered. Officers whose names appeared again and again. Testimony he had accepted because it was easier to trust the uniform than to question it. He remembered how often he had overruled public defenders, how often he had told himself that procedure mattered more than discomfort. He swallowed hard. At the prosecution table, Nathan Walker stared at the floor. The man who had walked into the courtroom that morning with confidence and calculation now looked smaller, folded inward. His shoulders slumped. His pen lay untouched beside his file. The tailored suit that had once fit him like armor now looked like a costume he had outgrown. Walker did not raise his head. He did not need to. He knew exactly what the footage meant. Not just for this case, but for every shortcut he had taken, every officer he had trusted, because it benefited him to do so. The email on his phone felt heavier now, burning in his pocket like a brand. His career was over. Behind him, Holt had risen halfway out of his seat again, hands gripping the back of the bench in front of him. His face was red, anger, fear, disbelief colliding without direction. "That video doesn't show the whole thing," he barked, voice cracking. "You can't hear what he said to us. You can't see what he did before." "Officer Holt," Judge Whitman said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "You will sit down." Holt hesitated. His eyes darted toward the exits, then to Riley, then to Cruz. Riley had gone still. For the first time, the mask slipped. The gentle, concerned expression was gone, replaced by something raw and exposed. His lips pressed into a thin line, his chest rising and falling too fast. He avoided looking at the jury, staring instead at his own hands as if they no longer belonged to him. Cruz looked worse. He sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor between his boots. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Sweat darkened the collar of his uniform. The young officer who had once laughed nervously now looked like a man watching the ground collapse beneath his feet. In the gallery, Kevin Brooks forgot to write. His pen hovered uselessly above the page, frozen. He had come expecting nothing, a minor case, a quick article if he was lucky. Instead, he had just watched a lie unravel in real time, layer by layer, with the clarity of a confession. His heart raced. This was not just a story. This was the story. At the defense table, Emily Carter remained standing. Her expression was composed, but there was steel beneath it now. She watched the room carefully, not with satisfaction, but with focus. This was not about triumph. It was about completion. About making sure the truth, once revealed, could not be folded back into silence. She spoke quietly. Your Honor, the defense would like the record to reflect that the defendant did not raise his hands, did not advance, and did not resist at any point shown in the footage. Judge Whitman nodded slowly. So noted. Ethan did not look at Emily. He did not look at the jury. His gaze remained fixed straight ahead as if anchored to something only he could see. Inside, memory continued its quiet march. Faces, names, men who had sat where he sat now and never left, men whose footage had never existed, men whose silence had been taken as proof of guilt. Ethan had learned their stories not from reports, but from visiting rooms, from letters written in careful handwriting, from phone calls cut short by time limits. The courtroom shifted again, this time irreversibly. No one laughed. No one whispered. The weight of what had been done, what had been allowed, hung openly in the air. Judge Whitman removed his glasses, setting them down with deliberate care. He rubbed his eyes, then looked up, gaze sweeping the room. I have presided over this court for more than 2 decades, he said slowly, and I have never. His voice faltered. He cleared his throat. I have never seen evidence so directly contradict sworn testimony. Holt scoffed weakly, shaking his head, but the sound died quickly when no one joined him. This court, Whitman continued, will take a brief pause before proceeding further. The gavel came down once. Not loud, not dramatic. Final. As the bailiff called the recess, no one stood immediately. People remained frozen, caught between shock and realization. Angela Morris wiped her tears, drawing a slow breath. She looked at Ethan, not as a defendant, but as a man. Kevin Brooks finally began to write, his hand moving fast, urgent. Walker stayed seated, head bowed. Holt stared forward, jaw clenched, the certainty that had once defined him now fractured beyond repair. Ethan Cole did not move. The truth had spoken for him, and it could not be denied. The courtroom was still standing when the truth finished settling, but it no longer felt intact. It felt exposed, like a structure stripped down to its beams, every weakness suddenly visible. Judge Whitman had just ordered the recess when Emily Carter rose again. Your Honor, she said calmly, not loudly but with a certainty that commanded the room, before the court adjourns, the defense has one final motion, a motion to correct the record. Whitman looked up, his eyes tired, wary. Correct what, Miss Carter? The identity of the defendant. A ripple of confusion moved through the courtroom. Nathan Walker lifted his head for the first time in minutes. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open. "What does that mean?" he asked hoarsely. Emily turned slightly, one hand resting on the defense table. "My client has been proceeding under a cover identity authorized by federal court order. His name is not Ethan Cole." She paused. Just long enough. "His name is Ethan Cole, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he has been operating undercover as part of a federal corruption investigation." The room reacted all at once. Gasps, chairs scraping, a sharp intake of breath from the jury box. Someone in the gallery whispered, "No way." Judge Whitman froze. His hands tightened on the bench as he stared down at Ethan. Really stared this time. Not as a defendant, not as a statistic, but as a man who had walked into his courtroom carrying authority far greater than anyone present. Walker stood abruptly. This is misconduct," he stammered. "He lied to the court. This is grounds for a mistrial." "No," Emily said, cutting him off. "He complied with a sealed federal directive, one your office was notified of this morning." Walker's knees seemed to buckle. He sat back down slowly, as if gravity had doubled. Before Judge Whitman could respond, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 3 figures entered. They moved with quiet precision, unhurried but unmistakably purposeful. 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in dark suits, earpieces barely visible. The woman walked in the center. She was Deputy Assistant Attorney General Laura Hensley, mid-50s tall, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Her face was sharp, intelligent, carved by years of conflict she had not lost. She did not smile. She did not look around. She walked straight toward the bench. Behind her were 2 FBI agents. One was broad-shouldered, clean-cut, eyes constantly scanning. Agent Marcus Shaw, Ethan's protective detail leader. The other, slimmer and younger, was Agent Nina Alvarez, sharp-eyed, alert, her hand resting near her jacket as if it were second nature. Judge Whitman stood. "Your Honor," Hensley said, voice even, controlled. "This court is now operating under federal jurisdiction." The room erupted into stunned silence. Hensley turned, addressing the room without raising her voice. "Special Agent Ethan Cole has been the lead field commander on an undercover operation investigating systemic corruption within the Riverside Police Department and the District Attorney's Office. His arrest, prosecution, and this trial were permitted to proceed to document misconduct under oath." She turned her gaze to Walker. "Mr. Nathan Walker," she continued, "you are hereby removed from this case, effective immediately. You are instructed to surrender your credentials and remain available for federal investigators." Walker didn't argue. He couldn't. An FBI agent stepped forward, hand outstretched. Walker fumbled with his badge, his hand shaking so badly he dropped it once before picking it up again. He didn't look at anyone as he handed it over. Behind him, Officer Brian Holt surged to his feet. "This is a setup!" he shouted. "This is entrapment! You can't do this! We were doing our jobs!" Agent Shaw moved instantly. "Officers Brian Holt, Mark Riley, and Daniel Cruz," Shaw said, voice firm and flat. "You are under arrest." Agent Alvarez stepped beside him, cuffs already in hand. Holt stared, disbelieving. "Arrested? For what?" Hensley answered. "Assault under color of law, evidence tampering, perjury, civil rights violations, conspiracy." The cuffs clicked shut around Holt's wrists. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Riley stood slowly, hands trembling at his sides. His face was ashen, eyes fixed on the floor. He did not resist. He did not speak. When the cuffs closed around his wrist, he flinched but said nothing. Could not bring himself to look at Ethan. Cruz broke. As the agents approached him, his knees buckled. He sank onto the bench, sobbing openly, his words tumbling out between gasps. "I didn't want to," he cried. I changed the reports. Dozens of them, they told me to. I was scared." Agent Alvarez paused, studying him, then nodded once. "You'll have an opportunity to tell that to federal investigators." Cruz didn't look up as the cuffs closed. In the jury box, Angela Morris watched in stunned silence, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Near the aisle, Officer Lucas Grant, the young patrolman who had quietly helped, stood frozen. An FBI agent approached him, resting a hand briefly on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," the agent said quietly. "You'll be protected." Grant swallowed hard, nodding, eyes glassy with relief. As Holt was led toward the aisle, panic finally shattered his anger. He twisted around, staring at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. "I didn't know," he said hoarsely. "I swear, I didn't know who you were. I have a family." The courtroom held its breath. Ethan stood. He rose slowly, unhurried, straightening to his full height. The slouched posture was gone. The man who stood now was composed, grounded, unmistakably authoritative. He turned to face Holt, his expression calm but unyielding. "That," Ethan said evenly, "is exactly the problem." He stepped closer, not threatening, not angry, just present. "You didn't know who I was," he continued. "And you didn't care. You saw a black man you thought was disposable. You believed the badge made you untouchable." Holt's mouth opened, then closed. "How many others?" Ethan asked quietly. "How many men who didn't have cameras? Who didn't have backup? Who didn't get a second chance?" Holt had no answer. Ethan stepped back. "Take them," he said simply. The agents led Holt, Riley, and Cruz out of the courtroom, the sound of chains following them down the aisle. No one spoke. No one looked away. Judge Whitman lowered himself back into his chair, visibly shaken. "The charges against Special Agent Ethan Cole," he said, voice unsteady but resolute, "are dismissed with prejudice. This court offers its formal apology." Ethan nodded once. Justice had arrived. Not loudly, not cleanly, but undeniably. By late afternoon, sunlight finally broke through the clouds over Riverside. The rain that had clung to the city all morning had stopped, leaving the courthouse steps damp and reflective, as if the building itself were catching its breath. Inside Courtroom 4B, the air no longer felt stale. It felt cleared, scrubbed raw by truth and consequence. Judge Harold Whitman stood once more, his posture straighter than it had been all day. His voice, though still worn with age, carried a firmness that had been missing before. "This court formally dismisses all charges against Special Agent Ethan Cole with prejudice," he said. "On behalf of this bench, I offer a public apology for the failures that occurred here." He paused, eyes lifting from the docket to Ethan. The apology was not dramatic. It was not loud, but it was real. Ethan nodded once, accepting it without ceremony. The bailiff announced the adjournment, and the room released a collective breath. Jurors stood slowly, many turning back for one last look at Ethan. Not as a defendant, but as a man who had stood in their place and endured. Angela Morris lingered a moment, her eyes meeting Ethan's. She pressed her hand to her heart and nodded, a small, grateful gesture that carried more weight than words. Outside the courtroom, federal agents moved efficiently, sealing offices and escorting personnel for interviews. The Riverside Police Department was now under comprehensive federal investigation. Patrol schedules were suspended. Evidence rooms were audited. Command staff were placed on administrative leave. The old routines, so comfortable, so unquestioned, were gone. Within days, an interim leadership team arrived from the state capitol to restructure the department. Training protocols were rewritten. Body camera policies tightened. A civilian review board was established with real authority, not symbolic oversight. It was not a miracle cure. It was a beginning. Across the city, case files long thought closed were reopened. Men and women who had carried convictions like chains were contacted, some for the first time in years. A public defender's office, long underfunded and ignored, received emergency grants to review past pleas tied to Officers Holt, Riley, and Cruz. Names surfaced, patterns emerged. Silence was replaced by scrutiny. On the courthouse steps, a press conference took shape. Microphones crowded the podium, their cables snaking across wet stone. Camera lights flicked on, humming softly. Reporters jostled for position, the mood sharp and electric. At the center stood Ethan Cole, now in a simple charcoal suit. He looked different, not transformed, but aligned. His posture was upright, his expression calm. The man who had once made himself small no longer needed to. To his right stood Deputy Assistant Attorney General Laura Hensley, impassive and resolute. To his left was Emily Carter. Emily had changed too. She wore a tailored blazer that fit her shoulders, her auburn hair still pulled back, but her stance confident, grounded. The quiet had not left her. It had found purpose. In the hours since the verdict, she had been formally appointed to a federal legal task force within the Department of Justice, an assignment that would pull her into cases like this across the country. She accepted it without fanfare, knowing the work ahead would be heavier than any title. Ethan leaned toward the microphones. "I chose not to reveal my identity," he said evenly, "because I wanted to see how an ordinary person would be treated when stripped of resources, reputation, and benefit of the doubt." He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He stated facts. "I watched lies pass as routine," he continued. "I watched shortcuts taken because they were easy. And I watched people assume guilt because it fit a familiar story." Cameras clicked. "The law only has value," Ethan said, "when it protects those the system is most willing to overlook." A reporter called out a question about special privilege. Ethan shook his head gently. "Privilege would have ended this on the street," he said. "Accountability required staying." At the edge of the crowd, Kevin Brooks scribbled furiously, adrenaline steadying his hand. He had not slept. He did not care. This story, this reckoning, was the one that would define his career, not because it was sensational, but because it was true. He framed his questions carefully, listening more than he spoke, already shaping the narrative with respect instead of haste. As the press conference wound down, Ethan stepped away from the podium. The crowd parted, cameras still rolling. He paused at the top of the steps. Across the square, near a bus stop bench, a black man in his late 40s sat watching. His name was Samuel Green. He was tall, thin, wrapped in a threadbare coat, his beard streaked with gray. Years earlier, a minor stop had turned into a charge he couldn't fight. The conviction cost him his job, then his home. He had learned to live quietly, to expect nothing from institutions that had already decided he did not matter. Samuel met Ethan's eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Samuel smiled. Small, cautious, as if testing the weight of hope before trusting it. He raised 2 fingers in a subtle salute. Ethan returned the gesture. It was not redemption. It was recognition. As evening settled, Riverside felt different. Not healed, but awake. Conversations shifted in diners and living rooms. Parents explained the news to children. Officers elsewhere took inventory of their own practices, some defensive, some reflective. The ripple moved outward, uneven and imperfect, but moving. Emily Carter left the courthouse with a thin folder under her arm. Assignments, contacts, timelines. She paused beside Ethan. "This won't be easy," she said quietly. He smiled, just enough. It wasn't supposed to be. They walked down the steps together, not triumphant but resolved. Behind them, the courthouse doors closed softly. Ahead, the city waited, watching now and finally willing to be watched back. This story is not only about a courtroom, a badge, or a dramatic moment of justice. It is about everyday life. It reminds us how easily people are judged by appearances, by silence, by skin color, or by where they come from. In daily life, we may not hold power like a judge or a police officer, but we all make choices. We choose how we speak to others. We choose whether we listen, whether we question, and whether we treat someone with dignity even when it is inconvenient. The lesson is simple and human. Silence is not weakness, poverty is not guilt, and authority does not equal truth. Justice begins long before a courtroom. It begins in how we treat people when no one is watching. It begins when we refuse to laugh at cruelty, when we refuse to accept lies just because they are familiar, and when we choose courage over comfort. If this story moved you, take a moment to look around your own life. Speak up when something feels wrong. Be kind when the world expects indifference. Teach your children to see people, not labels. Small actions, repeated every day, are how real change begins. If you believe stories like this matter, please share this video so others can learn and reflect as well. Let us know in the comments what part of the story touched you the most. If you believe justice, dignity, and compassion still have a place in this world, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss future stories. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you in your daily life. If you pray for a world with more fairness, kindness, and truth, type Amen in the comments.